All right, so in this one, I'm going to kind of freestyle a little bit on Christ and Lucifer. I see these as really kind of two ends of a pole. I think there's a lot of interesting commonalities and kind of inverse truths with them. And so I'm just going to riff on that for a while. In this, I think I'm going to experiment with a little different kind of speaking and teaching style. At least I think I am. We'll see how it goes as I get into it. But I may go a little slower. I may allow myself some more pauses to kind of let things fill in as they do. So yeah, let me just see how that goes. So what I want to start by pointing out, and I'm going to I can just sense that I'm going to keep doing this again and again and again during the presentation, is just to re-anchor what I believe to be a foundational truth, not just about Christ and Lucifer, really about all of us. But I think Christ and Lucifer present a really interesting demonstration of this, which is that they're both God, right? And I'll use G to represent God. And so, you've got Jesus up here, JC, you've got Lucifer down here, and both Christ and Lucifer are God, right? And this is, again, these are my beliefs, these are my teachings, and I'll just, kind of say it matter-of-factly sometimes, but I'm acknowledging that this is what I believe. I think it's tempting sometimes to think of God as kind of like a watchmaker or a jewelry maker, someone in like a workshop, maybe almost like a Santa Claus that, kind of makes all these toys, us and mountains and birds and octopuses and whales and all those things, and then just kind of like sets them out there in some realm or something, and then God's sitting in the workshop thinking of what to do next or checking in on them. And I when I was younger, basically my belief process was, I believed when I was younger. I was raised Catholic. Sometime around middle school I stopped believing, and that held until about 3 or 4 years ago. And now I believe again. But I think what's different about my belief now than when I was younger is before I had that model that I described before, call it God the jewelry maker. And now the model is really more that everything is God. And the difference between perhaps God and God's, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving state as the creator of all, and the difference between God being this pen or me or a booger I pick out of my nose or whatever, is essentially that God is manifesting into physical form and really imposing limitations on God's self, including for us as conscious beings, the awareness that we are in fact God, right? We are God who is essentially kind of temporarily lobotomized or kind of drugged himself or herself with disbelief, with ignorance, with all these qualities, to essentially allow God to have an immersed experience for purposes that are ultimately mysterious us to right now, known to God in the full state. But when God instantiates individuals such as Christ or Lucifer or me or you, it's not like God is at some remove. We are God. And what God was kind of crazy about God is that God will essentially shove God's self down into these situations and even allow God's self to forget temporarily who and what God is. And so this, people can call it panpsychism or panspirituality. I think that is more akin to what I believe now and what I see now. And so what's wild about that is, and actually let me back up for a second. So going back to the watchmaker view, I think if I wanted to debate with myself or with someone else, in theological debate, we can debate the wisdom of theological debates. But, let's say I wanted to get into a discussion about it. I think what I would say now is I'm like, well, how does this notion of God as the watchmaker work? Like, what is God? Like when God, makes the jewelry and puts it out into the world, or when God makes the creatures and sets them out, but they're not God. God is something separate. It's like, well, what is God putting them out into? Is that space? Was that created by a different God? Like, how does God create something other than God's self? And I think God does create things that when you look at them, we as God may not recognize them immediately as God, because they don't have the qualities that we expect God to have and that we do believe God in God's essence does have. And so it's just kind of this wild concept of like, if you do believe God is all powerful and all present, where does God end exactly? Like where do we draw that line? And I think it's the primate parts of our mind, good and bad, wanting to chunk things into desirable and undesirable, worthy and unworthy, that wants to remove here and see God on this side of the line and not God on this side of the line. Whereas I think the truth is it's all God, turtles all the way down, God all the way down. But God, we are just this kind of crazy being who, one, diversifies into all these different forms and perspectives, and then two, perhaps most wildly of all to us as primates, essentially surrenders himself to ignorance and to disbelief with a divine plan and a divine purpose. I don't think God surrenders God's self into chaos. I think there's always built into God's surrender is God's return to the full self, which I believe is the state of oneness from which God emerges. But it's just kind of wild to me, the thought that that God would do that God would actually put God's self into God's own creation, which is God, and essentially stitch disbelief and ignorance and confusion and all these other qualities into the brain to essentially convince God to recreate this line in God's own mind to divide God's instantiated physical self from God's awareness of God's total self. It's kind of a wild concept, but I think we see it playing out all the time. And anyone, in my belief system, anyone who doesn't believe in God is God not believing in themselves. And that's actually perfect. It's not a mistake they're making. It's not some foolish thing they're doing. God's plan is unfolding perfectly, the only way it can. And so the tricky part is in time, we make the mistake of abstracting things and trying to optimize. We're like, oh, okay, well, you're here, right? And where you really want to be is here, and here's what's holding you back and all the mistakes you're making. And so we regret that we're at this point in the process instead of this point, instead of appreciating that the process of time is the unfolding of God's will. And so wherever you are at a given point in time is exactly where you're supposed to be, exactly where you were in the past, same, exactly where you go in the future, same. So perfection essentially is inescapable. I think that's one of the qualities of God's surrender is, yes, God surrenders God's self into disbelief and ignorance and foolishness and folly, sin, evil, all of these things. And yet God is also surrendering God into God's self, into the perfection of God's unfolding plan, which is what I picture kind of a journey out and in, right? God starts as God's self, puts God's self all the way out into deep depths of confusion and disbelief, right? Gradually realizes the truth, and that truth is what guides God back home. And along the way, there may seem to be miraculous happenings, coincidences. It may look like things could have gone a different way than the other. And we may say, God, I would have never been able to make this return journey if I hadn't had this moment. And I wouldn't have had this moment if this hadn't happened, and this hadn't happened, and this happened, and this hadn't happened. And if they all hadn't coalesced at the same time. Whereas if we zoom out and see it from God's perspective, these were all stones along the path that were essentially designed from the very beginning. And it's only from the perspective of the experiencer, right, the incarnated being who doesn't have the omniscient perspective, that these things can seem dramatic, surprising, upsetting obviously at times, agonizing at times, terrible at times, unbearable at times, and then at other times ecstasy, and then at other times a lot of things in between. This is basically the nature of experience unfolding in time, which requires ignorance or delusion in order to actually have the experience, because of course if we saw it always from God's perspective, there would be no drama to give us on the way out, and then there would be no kind of feeling like there's a call home which brings us back. So Christ and Lucifer are both God, and I believe they're essentially kind of Siamese twin spirits of gods that have been separated, and now, at least in the human psyche, occupy these deeply polarized positions, right? The Christ consciousness we associate with so many good things. The Lucifer consciousness has become kind of our scapegoat. We see it as kind of the seed of all evil, the seed of all temptation, things like that. And what I want to try to convey in this video here is to really try to some degree, complicate that concept and that dichotomy, and to really show how they actually rely and feed off of each other, really are in some way two sides of the same coin, and that they both have a very important role to play from the human perspective in the evolution of the human and in the process of the human in that cycle I talked about before, the going out from the God self into ignorance, into disbelief, into drama, plays a role in the enlightenment moment, and then a role in the return journey where we shed our ignorance and our disbelief, our prejudices, all those things that allow us to think of ourselves as autonomous individuals, and to really weave ourselves back into the fabric of all that is and return to our state of unconditionally loving awareness in the Godhead or the God state. And so what I'm going to do is kind of lay out how I see the Christ consciousness and the Lucifer consciousness playing out in that. And what I'll say at the outset is I'm not really staking a position on whether Jesus Christ was a actual historical figure, whether he performed miracles during his lifetime, whether he died and resurrected. I obviously don't know firsthand. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to take those as essentially mythically true, right? I'm going to take the story of Christ as a myth, as kind of an archetypal narrative that reflects very powerful themes, both for us as a species and us as a society, and then I think really most importantly, us as individuals. And whether that maps onto a historical person and meets it in all the details, again, I'm not taking a position on that, so I'm just going to kind of work off of my understanding of the New Testament and take that as a mythic truth for the purposes of this discussion. And then likewise with Lucifer, the mythic tradition I'm working with there is the angel in heaven, perhaps even the darling angel of God, essentially rebelling against God, trying to supplant God and basically become God, to take over, no longer wanting to be a lieutenant or to be something other than the supreme ruler, actually coming in and saying, nope, I'm going to take over, this is my business now, being defeated, and then having his reign in hell essentially be the results. Sorry, I'm kind of getting my camera repositioned here, it's shifting on me, but having these taking the throne in hell being the result of his rebellion against God. And so what I'll say from the outset is I think the role that these two are playing for us is Lucifer is the light shining out of the darkness, and Christ is the light shining into the darkness. And what I think is actually happening here is essentially we, humanity, right, are here. The light, essentially a shadow is what happens, right, when you have a light source, it hits something that blocks the flow of light, and then it creates what appears to be an absence of light behind it, right? And I think our shadow is essentially from God's light, right, which is ultimately our light, but we're here identifying in our incarnated being. We then create a shadow, right? And that shadow isn't evil, it's not bad, it's just denied. It's that part of ourself that isn't receiving the light in that moment. This is perhaps where our ignorance and our confusion and our disbelief are operating. And it's because by design, right, that light, God's light of awareness, is not reaching that aspect of who we are. If we map that onto the yin-yang, right, we got the darkness on this side, the little bit of light, and we got the light on that side with a little bit of darkness. This would be the same thing. God's here, God's light is shining this way. This is almost maybe like a human head. And what faces forward, right, what we present socially, what we present to ourselves as individuals when we're saying, who am I, what I'm about, is we present the light, the qualities we think are acceptable, we think are good, we think are worthy. And then we tend to shove a lot of our qualities back into the shadow when we think they're not. And so if we look at that here, we could say that Christ is manifesting much more of God's essential energy, which is unconditionally loving awareness. Call that ULA. Right? Christ is shining that here. So essentially, kind of in this mythic framing, there's a shadow that's actually being created in this direction. And that, in fact, is where we put Lucifer, right? We deny Lucifer as us. We deny the Lucifer consciousness within us. We deny that we have that ambition in us, that rebellious streak, that hunger to be in charge, that hunger to control everything, that distrust that everything's going to play out in a way that's ultimately good for us, that impatience, that urgency, and that willingness to resort to essentially bullying or violence or other forms of vice to try to accomplish, to try to serve our selfish needs, right? We know we have that in us, right? We recognize that in others very easily, but we don't so easily recognize it in ourselves. And again, that's because we shove a lot of those energies into our darkness, and we identify so strongly with what's in the light and disidentify with what's in the darkness that we really aren't able to recognize this in ourselves. Or if we do, we then quickly deny it or hate ourselves for it, get into a pride or shame game to try to reestablish this thick divide between what's good and what's bad in our view. Of course, from God's perspective, nothing is good and bad. It's all God. It's all love. All of this, though, is essentially the creation that God makes so that we can have these embodied experiences in ignorance and disbelief, as I talked about before. Okay, so we have the shadow, right, which is created by God's love hitting us, right? It's the darkness that's created by ourselves, right, our presented selves, our forward selves, blocking the flow of light behind us. And this is where Lucifer operates. So that's why Lucifer is the light shining out of the darkness. Christ is the light shining into the darkness, because Christ's love doesn't just hit us in the face and end. It continues and reaches everything that's here. Lucifer's love, likewise, reaches all the way up into the light fully as well. And the reason I think this is important, or the reason I'm pointing this out, is because essentially Christ and Lucifer are kind of like our front and rear guards along the entirety of our journey, right? So I've been drawing this image of this loop out and this loop back. You could think of it kind of like hike, right? The origin point, the trailhead, is our God self. This journey out is a journey into ignorance, into disbelief, into selfishness, right? Into being, thinking of oneself as an autonomous, independent, closed off being, as opposed to just being an aspect of God. And then we have the enlightenment moment here, the realization, kind of the call home, and then the return home, which is a gradual dropping of all the trappings of selfishness and selfhood, a gradual loosening of the ignorance and the disbelief, allowing for essentially a redemption and a rapture back into the Godhead. And I'll use red for Lucifer and blue for Christ to kind of show what I see them doing at each step along this journey. So as we're going out, Lucifer is essentially in the front, tempting and drawing us, right? Kind of saying, hey, come this way, take for yourself, right? See yourself as important. See yourself as more important than the rest. See yourself as worthy of taking what you want, right? No matter what it does to others, right? What are others anyway, right? They're people or things in your way. You are what's most important. You've got to take care of you, look out for you, extol you, essentially build a legacy for yourself, essentially kind of build a statue the size of the universe, kind of like dictators do in those kind of cartoonish regimes. Make yourself this kind of cartoonish, godlike figure, if nowhere else than in your own mind, right? Lucifer's really good at that. Again, that's Lucifer's jam. And so Lucifer's kind of in the front, guiding us as kind of our example. And so we emulate Lucifer as we do, and we're like, oh, hey. Now, of course, one of the tricks is we don't buy into this, right? Because if we did this, our ego and our pride would have trouble. We'd say, no, we're being manipulated. Lucifer's more powerful than I am. So Lucifer essentially just acts as a mirror, right? Who shows us back our own face. Lucifer's behind the mirror, right? You can think of it like a two-way mirror. When the person looks here, they get their own image bounced back. But it's really Lucifer who's creating that and filling it with all those thoughts, right? Of self-aggrandizement, megalomania, paranoia, and distrust of others. All those ingredients in the recipe of selfishness and self-absorption. Christ then is kind of operating from the back, right, and pushing forward. And I think the way Christ is doing that is as we're going on our kind of selfish path, we may start to get a feel, right, an instinct or a feeling like, hey, there's more to me than that, right? Maybe I'm not just, a selfish being trying to prop itself up and make itself seem important. Maybe I really have the Spirit of God within me. Maybe on a deeper level, I am God. And what I think Christ essentially does is kind of shines a blinding light. When we look back in this direction, Christ again kind of acts like a mirror, or really more like a window, and is flooding light back in this direction. Again, this is kind of a light reinforcing the ignorance that's necessary to be selfish within God's self. And, it's not a harmful light. It's not the flames of hell or anything like that. That's not Christ's jam. But it is a blinding, radiant light that keeps us in the dark of what's behind the light here. So we look this way, we see a mirror, right? And then Lucifer kind of whispering in our ear saying, hey, make yourself this grand, amazing person. And I'm number one. And then here, when we get that tug, that kind of homesickness for where we came from, the blinding light and love of Christ seems maybe in the moment to serve as kind of grace or protection. And of course it does. And I think what it's also doing is reinforcing the ignorance and kind of keeping us moving on this journey so that we don't start reversing too quickly, right? So again, Lucifer is kind of leading our way out, and Christ is kind of bringing up the rear to keep us moving along. And I see that same dynamic working all the way to the enlightenment point. Then when we get to the enlightenment point, things switch. And then I think this is actually kind of the more interesting, well, maybe just more interesting to me, but more interesting part of the journey, is now we got Lucifer in the back, we got Christ in the front, we got the individual in the middle. Now, right, the design is the individual is going to be moving forward, right, back toward the God self. And what this does, you could think of this as maybe kind of the putting on of an elaborate costume in a play drama, or like in a war metaphor, the putting on of elaborate armor, the arming oneself, strapping grenades, those big bandolero straps across the chest with shotgun shells in them. And, you're kind of looking like the Terminator, and you've got your sunglasses and your grizzled face and a little cigar out of your mouth, and you're tough and nothing can get to you. And come hell or high water, defiance essentially, right? That's like kind of the nitrous, the rocket fuel that keeps us going on this selfish path. Again, all in the perfection of God's design. And I'll just say, this is no better than this, right? This is all God. This is all perfection. Like I said before, it's just about where in time you're seeing yourself, and just remembering that at that moment in time, it can be nothing other than exactly where you're supposed to be at that time. Okay, so you've made the turn now, right? Down the stretch they come, and you're making your way back toward God. Now, the roles are really reversed. Christ is acting kind of like a headlight, right? Or like a headlamp. Maybe you can even put him like up here. And it's got a light shining in this direction, essentially showing us the way home, right? Because along the way, there's still going to be temptation. There's still going to be potential obstacles. There's still going to be confusion. And so that divine light of God's awareness essentially gives us a lamp. I think Christ also, and forgive me if I'm mixing my metaphors here, I'm still kind of experimenting, but can provide us with, I'll erase the headlamp for a moment, can also be something akin to, say, the North Star. From this perspective, we still can't see this. We can maybe sense it. It's kind of maybe like the sun, while the earth is still at night. It's there, right? The earth would freeze over in an instant if the sun wasn't shining. But you can't see it, right? You look up at the sky, it's dark. It went over the western rim a while ago. It's going to come up in the east at some point, but it's not there yet. I think Christ can be kind of like this North Star light that guides us in the direction we want to go. So even though we can't see the light of God's love, we still have that kind of Christ beacon, right? That shining light on the hill, maybe the lighthouse on the shore, or the North Star in the sky to serve as kind of a guidance. Right, that, or if we get stuck in little caverns along the way. Again, I make this look like it's a clean journey, but it's really full of twists and loops and mountains and valleys and rivers you got to swim across and all that stuff. So say you get down in a little cavern, you can't see the sky at all. Maybe that's where Christ is really more like the headlamp, helping you project light forward so that you can see more clearly along your way. Now Lucifer, I think Lucifer in this, you can see I'm kind of tickled by all this. Lucifer is like, now he's kind of the like personal trainer who's on your ass. And like, because along this way you might be like, oh my God, I'm tired. I kind of liked what I had up here. I get it. I was ignorant and I was delusional and I was, angry and confused and spiteful and all these things, serving a false god, which I really was a god, but it was because I put myself in this little container and thought only that container is God and everything else isn't, right? All that stuff, right? The little Easter egg. I'd be like, I miss that. I'm walking along, I've got virtue, I've got love, I've got light, but man, those old ways, wasn't there something nice about those? And Lucifer is now that kind of like, maybe kind of almost like a sheepdog too. Whereas if you start going up there, Lucifer kind of comes up and goes, yeah, how about that, right? And might bring you a memory from that experience, right? Might bring you a little visceral reminder of how it felt when you say hit bottom, or when you did something that you swore after doing it you would never do that again, right? So I think Lucifer is really kind of like this, again, he's kind of a sheepdog, this like harsh personal trainer, kind of like a drill sergeant, and he's bringing up the rear, right? He's shining the light out of the darkness, right? We're now moving, right? This was a descent into darkness, right? If we were to map this onto a yin-yang, right? We kind of took the loop around here, and then we were spending that time in the dark. Now we're actually making our way back toward the light. Lucifer is now the light shining out of that darkness, kind of pushing us in a way toward the light, because every time we turn back, he just messes with us, right? Makes life hell and torturous. And I gave these examples here of kind of giving you reminders, kind of like a friend does. He also will still be the tormentor and the kind of the god of mischief, the Loki that Lucifer can be. And if you go back here, he'll just drop his disco ball and let you go through your house of mirrors as you must, right? Again, everything happens perfectly. There's no mistakes along the way. If you find yourself in Lucifer's house of mirrors, that's where you as God, from your state of omnipotence, omniscience, and omni-lovingness, are deciding for yourself to be. In other words, if you knew everything and had complete control and had unlimited love, you would redo things exactly the way you're doing them now, because that in fact is what you're doing from that position. So if you go down into Lucifer's little hall of mirrors again, and all you can see is yourself, when you're on that return journey, what that is, I think that's Lucifer basically kind of giving you a little bit of hard medicine to remind you why you're going on this journey. And during that hard medicine, there may be more inspiration. You may be kind of a re-enlightenment experience, a reawakening, all for the grander purpose of kind of pushing this journey home. And so I just think that's kind of a funny dynamic to think of them as kind of like two guides or two kind of twin brothers who lead you on this expedition. They lead you on an expedition out with Lucifer at the head and Christ at the back, and then they lead you on the way back with those roles reversed. And along the way, they're both essentially keeping you driving forward in your general trend of progress. And they do that in their own little telltale ways. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of pivot. I'm going to play with another concept here. And that concept is this notion that in life, if what seems like bad things are happening to you, if it seems like you're being abused or victimized, kind of put through the grinder in a certain way, raked over the coals. Again, I would never want to suggest that anything can be reduced to a single purpose, but I think a significant part of that is it's kind of like a message from the spirit to itself about where the work is to be done. Essentially what it is along the way, right, as we're making that progress of the journey out and the journey back, it's like there's little steps we've got to take in each lifetime, right? And in a single lifetime, there's little steps we take in different phases of our life. And these different steps, you could think of it as kind of, on this outward journey, it's maybe an acquisition process of ignorance and disbelief of certain kinds. And then on this backwards journey, the journey home, which is the journey that I'm, just personally more interested in right now, I'm not sure where I am on this. I think I'm somewhere here. I don't know. But this definitely has a lot of my attention and my interest. And so it tends to be where my mind goes more often. Here, you're undoing a lot of that. You're essentially purging a lot of those false, beliefs and ignorances and negative attitudes and confusions we acquired along the way to give us a richness and drama of a personal experience. Those same, you think of them as kind of thorns we've embedded in ourselves. We pull those thorns out along the return journey so that we can eventually get back into ourselves. And so I think the way that works in a lifetime is like this. You have the spirit, and that spirit I think of as kind of like a filament. I've represented it this way. Another one I've been playing with recently is like a neon sign. So maybe you take the word beer, spell it out in like a neon tube, right? Light's coming in here, right? Or electricity's going in there, coming out here, and then this thing shines off a beautiful blue light. And in this form, it's perfect, right? There's no kinks, there's no crimps, there's no weak spots, no short circuits, nothing like that. So this can shine brilliantly. This is what a spirit's looking like when it's just being birthed by God, right? You can think of God as kind of a star nursery, and the spirit like a little star that's floating out of it, right? And there's, who knows how many spirits there are. I like to think there are as many as there are galaxies or stars in the universe. They're all being birthed out, sent on their individual journeys. And those spirits then incarnate themselves, just as God incarnates spirits. Spirits incarnate these physical beings, these perspectives of being a single thing in a single life. And the journey I laid out before, right, this journey out and this journey back, is a journey that the lowercase I, the physical being, experiences in the flow of time. And it's something the spirit experiences outside of time, right? Because the spirits, I don't believe, are in the flow of time. They live in a more ethereal realm. But what the spirit is doing is the spirit is in some way learning or maturing or growing. And the way that works is as you go on that out journey, what the spirit does is on its little beer sign or food sign, I think each one kind of like a snowflake has its own unique filament, its own unique sign. That sign starts to get little, I'm not going to call them flaws because they're part of a perfect design, but they're little points of occlusion or resistance or obstruction, right? Maybe there's a little pinch in it right here. Maybe this segment just goes out entirely, right? Maybe this segment gets cut off, so the R now is utterly dark. You can't even see it. Maybe there's a little crimp in the tube up here. And those, right, going back to our little out journey and back journey, those, I think, map onto these ignorances, delusions, confusions that we as God's self are embedding into ourselves, right? These thorns to give ourselves the experience of being a self. And those then are reflected in the spirit body as these kind of crimps or pinches or occlusions or blockages in the flow of God's love and divine light. So what was once this beautiful radiant sign and will be again in its return, on its outward journey and on the first part of its return journey, is really full of all these occlusions, all these blockages. And the way these work, the way I see it working, is these occlusions and blockages, again, are planted in the flow of divine creation. And when you go into a life, right, what essentially happens is the spirit, right, which is uppercase I, the human being, the body, is a projection of that spirit, right? It's essentially a portrait the spirit is painting of itself. Because the spirit, again, in this ethereal realm, can see things, can experience things, but it doesn't feel in the way we feel, right? It doesn't have that raw, intimate, visceral, touching feeling the way you do when you've got a real bad toothache, right? Or when you feel real hunger, or you feel real pleasure inside of yourself, real satisfaction when your throat is dry and hot after a vicious workout and you get that cold splash of water. That's a level of intimacy and depth of experience that I think on the spirit level we don't get. And so part of the reason we incarnate is to allow ourselves in this dense realm where time flows to have that deep experience. And one of the reasons is the spirit will essentially re-etch this, if it's a beer spirit, it'll re-etch this beer sign into the human being, right? In fact, the being is born with this. And then through trauma, right, through the traumas of life, traumas in utero, traumas in childhood, Traumas all the way into adulthood, traumas of the romantic kind, traumas within a family, traumas we inflict on ourselves, traumas inflicted upon us by another person, betrayal, you name it. It essentially recreates its blockage pattern in the human being in the form of pain and trauma. And so these little blockages I'm drawing down here, right, are attempting to mirror the blockages up here. And again, the spirit is doing this so that instead of just having this more abstracted geometric sense of where its blockages are, right, it can see them, but it can't feel them, right? So it can't really map them in full 3D and really have that intimate and deep relationship with them that you can get only through feeling. It gets that through life. And just the wild part, I think the part that for us is so counterintuitive, it sounds almost like it's made up, like it's science fiction or something out of a story, is that the traumas in our life, the times when we are victimized or we feel victimized, are actually the creations of our spirit done for the divine purpose of allowing us more intimate connection with the patterns of our own suffering. So essentially we re-stitch the patterns of occlusion in our spirit flow into our body, and they now become occlusions in the flow of energy in us, right? They'll get trapped in us. A trauma from my childhood may be trapped down in my pelvic region, right? A trauma from my teenage years may be trapped in my ribs. I may get an occlusion in my throat. And all of those are essentially the way the spirit is mapping its occlusions onto its own body, right? And I keep talking about them like they're separate, right? They really are one thing. Everything's one thing. And especially them, right? They're so intimately connected because the spirit, the physical being, it's not like the spirit is like a star in the sky twinkling above and the being is down on earth and it looks up and it goes, oh, spirit, you're so lovely and sweet. The being is the spirit incarnated in form. In other words, and not just the body, but everything the being ever encounters in its life. Every tree it sees, every ocean wave it encounters, every bird in the sky, every other person. These are all the projections of spirits into the physical realm. In fact, the physical realm is itself a projection of the spirit. You could think of it kind of like an immersive portrait, self-portrait in which the spirit walks around. And again, you don't want to reduce it to any single purpose, but in terms of this journey, the main reason we're incarnating is so that we can have this experience to intimately feel our occlusion patterns. And so in other words, what we can then do is we can say, okay, if I'm having this recurring pattern in my life where people keep, say, misunderstanding me, right? Like I say things and I'm talking, I think I'm being clear, but I get misunderstood and it leads to problems, right? People who I'm in relationships with leave me, right? Because I'm not understood. I have jobs and I keep losing my job because I'm not being understood, right? What this does, I think, is it gives us an opportunity to do two things. One, I think on the physical level, the best gift we can give ourselves when we feel, right, I'll use little kind of stars to represent those occlusions, those blockages, that old trauma from our past, which we're still carrying around. And now when we're being misunderstood, that trauma gets reactivated, these things start vibrating, right? Keep calling out, almost signaling, hey, this is something important. But the way we get fooled is we then get angry at being misunderstood, right? We look at that other person who's not understanding us, not getting it. Right? They're kind of like, I don't know, right? We get angry at them. We think that they're the problem. They're the ones who are making us upset. Instead of realizing they're actually doing us a gift, they're alerting us to these little kind of trapped energies inside of us, which we can free if only we stop externalizing the problem, right? And then also stop personalizing it. We don't want to turn it into we beating ourselves up. Just recognize, hey, these are here, and I can set them free by paying calm attention to what's going on inside of me, right? And I've got other videos that talk about practices for that, so I won't go in depth. And of course, there's many other teachers who have good teachings there. But the point I'm trying to make here is we can also do another thing, right? We can begin to do a little bit of the thinking that happens at the spirit level. And I'll admit up front, I think I do this too much. I think I try to reverse engineer my mind out of lowercase I into uppercase I, and I suffer for it. So take what I'm saying here with a grain of salt. This may actually be bad advice, but this is what I do. This is a pattern I see, and I do think there is a way that this can be done skillfully to help us basically do this process more effectively in life. And here's what I'm saying. If the pattern is you're being misunderstood, right? Misunderstood. That means inside, you within toward yourself are misunderstanding. You're misunderstanding something fundamental about your individual self or about the nature of what is, right? About the way the world is, about why we're here, right? There's some misunderstanding going on inside of you, and being misunderstood is kind of like your wink from God, right? Your little, hey, here's the pattern, right? Here's this little nodule inside you that keeps vibrating. It's a result of a misunderstanding in you. And so the reason I use this example is I think that Lucifer, right, if we look at the way he is in our human society, right, he is misunderstood, right? He is seen as the source of evil. He's God, right? He's evil and terrible. He's God, right? He's this awful, despicable. He's God, right? He's misunderstood. He's actually a guide who's helping us along the way, right? Leading the front here, leading the way back here, right? He's here to actually help us and serve us. His example serves as a cautionary tale, right? Against blind ambition, against selfishness, against not trusting the flow of time. And yet, if Lucifer consciousness, which I think is embedded in each of us, is to look out at the world and see how much Lucifer is misunderstood, what it does is I think it invites Lucifer to recognize that his sin, if you want to call it that, and I don't use sin in the stigmatized sense of you're doing something wrong. I use sin in the sense of you're doing something that's mistaken. You're doing something that is grounded in some kind of ignorance or confusion or delusion, which again on the outward journey is perfectly designed. The journey back, you're trying to purge those, or they are being purged without your trying. And so what Lucifer's pattern is, he keeps getting misunderstood, which I think the sign is that Lucifer, is misunderstanding. And what Lucifer is misunderstanding is essentially Lucifer's role in this entire process, right? Because in Lucifer, what we see, right, was in heaven, angel, sees God, which I'll represent as maybe the sun in the sky. And Lucifer's misunderstanding is Lucifer didn't want to do this. Lucifer didn't want to take the time to allow himself to go through the experience out and go through the experience back. Right? Lucifer wanted it all now. Lucifer wanted it all right now. Lucifer said, no, I'm going to cut this whole process out. I'm going to go straight to the top, and I'm going to cut the head off of the king and put myself on the throne. And his misunderstanding there was two things. First, you can try that, but how's it going to work? Well, Lucifer is kind of the example to us that it doesn't work. Right? What that does is it casts you down into hell. And again, you're not put in hell as a imprisonment. You're not put in hell as a punishment. In fact, Lucifer being put in hell is part of the divine plan, because that's how we're able to have him as our guide in the front on the way out and in the rear on our way back, right? So there's no mistakes here. There's nothing going wrong. And God isn't punishing Lucifer by putting him down there. Lucifer, as God, is essentially serving as this radiant example of a misunderstanding of the nature of reality and the nature of time. The nature of time is this unfolding that allows us to go through the full experience out and the full experience back. And if along the way we're trying to shortchange it by taking shortcuts, by rushing, doing things like that, we're essentially recommitting the sin of Lucifer, which is trying to get back to being God too quickly. God is choosing in every moment, from a position of all-knowingness, all power, and all love, to continue to have this journey in each of us that God is having, with all of its ups and downs, with all of its pains and agonies, right? God is choosing that. And Lucifer is kind of that example, that cautionary tale showing us, hey, if you're going to put your choice, your selfish choice, right, ahead of the flow of time, right, and you're going to essentially try to steal the throne ahead of schedule, you're going to suffer for that. And not, again, for Lucifer, it may seem like a punishment, it may seem like condemnation. And, from his perspective, that's understandable. I think we can look at it with compassion. But from a larger perspective, if we zoom out, he's really just giving us, and again, he is God, is kind of giving us this stark example of why we should avoid that temptation if we can, or we should at least recognize that temptation for what it is, which is a shortcut that doesn't get you there any faster and actually gets you oftentimes into more suffering than you had hoped for. What's kind of interesting though is the story of Lucifer isn't all sad, right? If we look at the example of Lucifer in Milton's Paradise Lost, he's not necessarily so upset, right? What's the line? He'd rather rule in hell than be a slave in heaven, something like that. Lucifer's a king down here, right? He's got a crown, he's got a kingdom, he's got subjects he rules over. So he kind of got what he wished for, which was to be God, but he's not the God of love, right? Because he wasn't willing to go through the process of faith and surrender to essentially relearn how to be loving. I think that's what this process is. We start as love, we go through this process of ignorance and delusion and disbelief. And then when we come back, it's not like it's all just forgotten and lost, right? You shake the Etch-a-Sketch clean. We come back, I think, with a richer appreciation for why love is so important, for why love is so powerful. And as creators, right, as God, when we recreate the experience next time, having gone through this, we really can empathize and have a deeper level of compassion with what it's like to be a physical being with needs and wants and confusions and fears, because we ourselves have walked that path. And if you think about it, if you were going to design a God to design a universe for you, wouldn't you want a God who has done this journey maybe trillions of times, so that this God knows deep in God's belly what it's like to be a being in God's creation, right? I think that's kind of a cool feature to think about. And Lucifer is kind of God making this mistake, right? You've got to learn by trial and error. That's really the only way we learn. And Lucifer is kind of the extreme example of this error of wanting to rush the process, of wanting to get back to the top too quickly. And so what happens as a result? Lucifer doesn't get to be the God of love. Lucifer gets to be the God of hate. Lucifer doesn't get to be the God of truth. Lucifer gets to be the God of lies and confusion and ignorance and everything else that we have in the darkness. Now, of course, this is not Lucifer's fate, right? Lucifer is on this path, Lucifer self, and as Lucifer leads us, individual human beings and the human species, back toward our origin, I think Lucifer and Christ's fates are kind of tied with ours, right? They're our guides, right? And just as the guide goes out with the people on the expedition and comes back with them, that's what Lucifer and Christ are going to do. So it's not like Lucifer is banished here, right? This notion of an eternal hell, I think, is a false one. It can be in a seemingly eternal hell, right? An interminable hell, seemingly, but not in truth. In truth, Lucifer will return just as Christ does. All will melt back into the full Godhead, God consciousness. And what we'll get from this experience is essentially experience itself, that deep intuitional knowing of what it's like to be alive. So the fact that Lucifer is so misunderstood by us as human beings, I think reflects his core sin of misunderstanding. Right? And so let me just briefly continue to map on that. Go back to yin-yang. Right? What we have in our shadow, right, is usually our source of redemption, right? We've hidden something in us here, right, on our out journey. We keep something buried inside of us. When we get back here, as we unravel the layers of our darkness, we'll stumble upon these jewels, and these jewels will be part of what guides us back, right? These pearls of wisdom, this deep in-knowing, which in this phase is in shadow, and in this phase gradually becomes more and more light. Right? And for Lucifer, it's his misunderstanding about the value of this process, right? Him wanting to always shortchange it. And if he's here in the light, you can almost think of this like these are like the two pupils of the eyes. But we look out of this one and deny what we see here, right? Because again, we've got to keep this in ignorance. And what he keeps seeing from humanity, right, from us, me and you right now today, is all these people saying Lucifer sucks, Lucifer's terrible, Lucifer's awful. F Lucifer, screw Lucifer, right? And he's misunderstood. He's actually our helper. He's guiding us. He's doing a job that we probably wouldn't want to do. Would you want to play this role? Would you want to be the king of hell? You're God too, right? Maybe we should be grateful that we didn't draw the lot that Lucifer did in this instantiation of the physical universe, right? Lucifer in this way is kind of a hero. He drew the short straw in a way for this, because he has this wild, I mean, you want to talk about a fall, he went from being the closest thing you have to God to being cast into the depths of hell. He went from here to here, right? Like, or right here, right before the dawn, he went to that point in a flash, right? Because he led his rebellion, him trying to avoid his path got him actually shoved into the worst place of his path ahead of schedule. And so when he is seeing himself being misunderstood by people, that's reflecting for him the fact that misunderstanding is kind of his sin, it's his ignorance, his darkness. And as he begins to realize that, that's what's going to allow him to turn the corner and to begin to incorporate more of his darkness into his light, more of his light into his darkness, where eventually he can break down this barrier and be whole. Okay, so now let's do Christ. I think Christ is actually a little more fun here. Lucifer was funner to describe on the path, but now Christ is a little more fun for me to describe in life. Because, and again, I'm going here off my understanding of kind of Christ from the New Testament. Jesus was kind of a dick, kind of a jerk, and he was a lot of other things too, and I don't in any way mean to say he was that primarily, right? I mean, for the love of God, his teachings were beautiful, his example was beautiful, his sacrifice was ultimate. We can go on and on about how beautiful and great Jesus is, and a lot of people do, and I'm one of them. I think he provides a beautiful example as a beautiful teacher. But he wasn't perfect, right? He was kind of a dick, and he kind of actually undermined and contradicted his own message in some ways. And the examples I'm thinking about here is basically when he lost his cool, right? He went into the temple and the money changers were there and started flipping over tables. Hey, they're God, buddy. They're on their journey, right? And he's flipping over tables, getting all mad at them. You know, sometimes the Pharisees, who were kind of the, the old guard, the, hyper-conservative, stuck in their old ways, all about dogma, all about propriety, and then they're often hypocritical too. Obviously, it's understandable why, as a human being, Jesus would get pissed off at them. But as the incarnation of God, right, as the beacon of God's light, the light shining into the darkness of density of human life, why was he getting, he'd debate them and would try to one-up them and kind of, confuse them or challenge their ways? Why was he getting enmeshed in all that, right? And then he has the temptation in the desert, and he's like, Satan, get thee behind me, Satan, right? Doing all these things. And, maybe to call him a jerk is the wrong word, but it's kind of he uses the lever of fear, the lever of shame or dominance, to kind of move his message forward, or he leaned on that during his life. And again, this was not in any way a flaw of his. There is no flaw. Everything is in God's divine plan. I think it really is beautiful and poetic in a way, because it shows that even the incarnated Son of God in this mythic example still is human, still has qualities in his shadow, right? And they show sometimes when he loses his cool, when he gets angry. He still acts like a person does, which is the ends justify the means. In other words, yeah, I'll use fear, and I'll use bullying, and I'll use domination, right? The same techniques of Satan or of Lucifer, go figure. In this moment, even though they're not my main themes, even though my teachings aren't about that, and even though, when I'm preaching and I'm healing people, I'm doing things, obviously I'm conjuring a very different vibe, but when I'm losing my cool, I'm being human just like the others. I'm being a bit of a jerk. I'm kind of using pushiness to try to get my way. And perhaps I'm rationalizing or justifying it, saying, hey, my way is God's way. But my means are not always God's means, right? And so I think that's what Jesus kind of represents. And what's interesting is, if we think about what happened to him, and he got nailed to a cross, right, was tortured viciously before that, had a sword run through his side, and he died with a crown of thorns on his head, bleeding, right? So and if we think of Jesus, right, Jesus is obviously different in a way than we are, because he's kind of this archetypal, I think, manifestation of God in our reality. So, Christ consciousness, I don't think is necessarily the same as any other individual consciousness, although I'll get there, but Jesus, I think, at his time, instantiated it more quickly than a lot of us do. I think he still had the same general dynamic, though, spirit and incarnated being. And what did he become? He became a suffering martyr, and he was abused. And I think this was reflecting in a way, so, kind of martyrdom and abuse, or maybe his two things, he's abused and he's martyred. So what does that indicate? Take off the E, take off the D, right? In this case, the ED. He's thinking of himself as a martyr, right? He's relying on abuse of other people. At times, again, not his dominant theme by any means, but at times he flashes it because that's where he's still doing his shadow work, right? He's on his own journey too, right? He's a leader in our journey. He plays a role for us in his journey, but he also is a human being, right? Playing his part. His spirit may not actually be the entirety of the Christ consciousness. The Christ consciousness may be kind of a higher level spirit, call it like an I raised to the power of I. And his spirit for that lifetime, right, for that incarnated experience of Jesus, channeled Christ consciousness through the spirit into the being. But this being still has its beer sign or its food sign with its occlusions. And he, in his lifetime, had that same pattern I was describing before. And his pattern, what I'm seeing, again, all I'm doing is basically reverse engineering from kind of the main thing that keeps happening to him that would probably be undesirable from a human perspective, being martyred and being abused, reflects on the inside what's still blocking him, right? What's still holding him back, the patterns he's still engaging in, even only inside himself, that are kind of keeping him in this outward journey, this position of ignorance and denial and disbelief, and ultimately needs to be purged for his return back. So he maybe has a bit of a martyr complex, right? And I don't know, I get that vibe a little bit, right? Like he's there, but he's praying in the garden before he goes, right? He's still having his doubts. He's on the cross. He says, Father, why have you forsaken me, right? And again, I hope I'm not in any way coming off as judgy. I'm really trying to be more observant of a pattern. And the pattern is, I think he got caught in the martyr complex a little bit. The human being of him, right, had that occlusion, right? It's in his spirit. It gets manifested in his body as maybe kind of a chip on his shoulder for martyrdom. And that may feed into a bit of the jerkishness that we see in him, because he knows what he is. On a deep level, he knows what he's going through. And then to suffer not only the indignities of what he knows to come, but then to have folks abusing him or misinterpreting or twisting his message or doing what he thinks is sacrilegious, I think brought out maybe a little bit of the righteous or indignant martyr in him. And that then reflects back to his spirit, aha, I see this little occlusion here, right, which this was vibrating when I was doing my martyr thing, right? I felt that was where it was acting from. The spirit is aware and sees that connection, and that's how the spirit begins to heal this, right? Either in this lifetime or in a future lifetime, instead of directing that anger outward at others, bringing it back in and essentially having a contemplative approach toward this, a meditative approach that invites this coil to soften itself in a peaceful and loving vibe. And then likewise, being abused, right? He was viciously abused on the way to the cross. The cross itself was a horrific form of abuse. This again, I think reflects, and I think it's tied to what I said before, so I won't go on this for too long, but essentially that same thing, which is, for as beautiful an example as Christ was of God's unconditionally loving awareness, at times it wasn't so unconditional, and at times it wasn't so loving. Now, of course, it was unconditional and loving from God's perspective because it was all parts of God's plan. That's why Christ didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't in any way flawed. I hope that this message is in any way suggesting that he's any less than what you thought of he was before. For me, it actually gives him an increased appreciation because I can see that he is Christ consciousness, which is a pretty beautiful reflection of God's self, right? Just as Lucifer consciousness is kind of this inverted version of God's self. But Jesus, right, if we take the Christ off of it, it's not his last name, right? Jesus was a dude from a spirit, and we're all of us, dude and dudettes, everybody, everything incarnated comes from a spirit, and those spirits have occlusions, and the flaws we have and the ways I keep using this word flaws, right? These occlusions we have and the way we manifest them in our behavior and the way they get reflected back onto us and the way we are treated by others, the way the universe treats us, acting as kind of a mirror showing us where we still have our occlusions. This is all part of the unfolding, right? This is all part of the process. And I think it's really kind of liberating that even if we think of Jesus as God's son, right, as God's self incarnated there, still wasn't perfect, right? Still lost the cool sometimes, right? Still committed some human sins, right? I think that gives us the hope to be able to emulate Jesus more easily, instead of seeing Jesus as only this perfect figure, this divine white radiance of light, unmatchable by people, beyond our imagination, our abilities. Jesus was a person like we are. Jesus had his faults and his shortcomings. Those shortcomings and faults were perfect in their way, and the way he was treated in his lifetime was a mirror to his spirit, allowing the spirit to see, okay, I get it. I maybe am falling into these patterns a little bit. So in this lifetime, I'm going to try to work on that. And then in the next lifetimes too, I'm going to remember that that's part of my patterning, and I'm going to see if I can unravel that. One, by not acting out these behaviors if possible, and then two, really going into the source, feeling into the body where these lie, and trying to heal them with more of a meditative, contemplative awareness, basically to try to shine the light of God's love onto them, instead of continuing to act them out and then have life spit them back at me as reverse behavior, saying, nope, that's not how you resolve this. That's not how you heal this. You don't heal it by acting it out and inflicting it on others. You don't get away from this pain by projecting it out onto other people or by acting it out onto other people. You do it by owning it in yourself, breaking this cycle of spreading the suffering and abuse, and then gradually healing this in the light of loving contemplative awareness. All right, let me just take a breath real quick, see if there's anything else I want to put on here before I stop. Yep, I think that's good.